The horses screamed and the carriage lurched sideways, throwing Margaret Ashford against the door with a force that knocked the breath from her chest. Rain hammered the roof like fists, and through the fogged glass she saw the road disappearing beneath churning mud. The driver shouted something she could not hear over the thunder, and then the reins snapped from his hands entirely, and the carriage was no longer moving on a road at all. It was flying. Margaret gripped the seat with both hands as the world tilted and spun. Trees blurred past the window, black shapes against a gray sky split open by lightning. She could hear the driver still shouting, could hear the terrible drumming of hooves that no longer answered to any command, and beneath it all, growing louder with every passing second, she could hear the river. She had crossed that river only an hour before, on her way to visit her ailing aunt in the village beyond Selworth land. The bridge there was old and narrow, barely wide enough for a single carriage, and beside it the bank dropped steep and sudden into water that ran fast and deep after days of rain. She had thought nothing of it then, she thought of nothing else now. The carriage struck a rut and left the ground entirely for one sickening moment before crashing down again, and Margaret was thrown to the floor, her bonnet torn loose, her hair falling free around her face. She scrambled back onto the seat, pulse hammering, and forced herself to look out the window rather than close her eyes, because some stubborn part of her refused to meet disaster blind. That was when she saw the rider. He came from the tree line at a furious gallop, low over his horse's neck, cutting across the field at an angle that would bring him alongside the runaway team within moments. His coat streamed behind him, dark against the storm, and even at that distance and speed there was something commanding in the way he rode, as though the wind itself had agreed to carry him faster. Margaret pressed her hand against the glass without meaning to, some instinct urging him on, though he could not possibly hear her. The bridge was close now. She could see the water below it, brown and swollen, tearing at the banks. The horses would never make the turn at this speed. The carriage would go into the river, and she along with it. The rider drew level with the lead horse. She watched him lean out, impossibly far, one hand closing around the loose bridle strap while the other kept his own mount steady at a killing pace. For a moment she thought he would be pulled from his saddle and trampled beneath both teams of horses, and she opened her mouth to scream a warning that would have done no good at all. Then the lead horse began to slow. It fought him first, tossing its head, nearly wrenching him from his seat, but he held on, his voice cutting through the storm in low, steady words she could not make out but could somehow feel, the way one feels a held breath. The second horse slowed to match the first. The carriage shuddered, the wheels finding some purchase in the mud, and the terrible speed began, at last, to bleed away. They came to a stop no more than 20 feet from the bridge, close enough that Margaret could see the water surging beneath it, close enough that her heart did not slow even after the wheels stopped turning. The driver was down from his seat in an instant, babbling apologies to the rider, to her, to the storm itself, but Margaret barely heard him. She was watching the man who had stopped the horses swing down from his own mount, with the same controlled economy of movement he had used to save her, and cross to the carriage door, and pull it open. Rain struck her full in the face. She looked up into a pair of gray eyes set in a face that gave away nothing, a face that might have been carved from the same stone as the bridge behind him. He was younger than she had expected, though there was nothing young about his expression. It was the face of a man who had already seen the worst the world had to offer, and had stopped being surprised by it. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, clipped, entirely without warmth, and yet she found herself grateful for it anyway, because it was steady, and steady was exactly what she needed. "No," she managed. "No, I don't believe so." Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together in her lap to hide it, though she suspected he had already seen. He looked past her, into the carriage, as though checking for some hidden injury she had failed to report, and then his gaze returned to her face and held there a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back and offered his hand to help her down. She took it. His grip was firm, gloved, entirely impersonal, and still something about the contact steadied her more than the ground beneath her feet did when she finally stood on it, legs unsteady, rain soaking through her cloak in seconds. "You came very near the river," he said, and there was something beneath the flat words that she could not immediately name, not quite feeling, something adjacent to it, held very carefully in check. "I am aware," she said, and to her own surprise, a small, unsteady laugh escaped her, born entirely of relief and shock rather than any real humor. "I had rather a good view of it from inside." Something flickered in his expression, gone before she could decide what it had been. Not quite a smile. Perhaps the memory of one. "The bridge would not have held the carriage at that speed," he said, "nor would the bank. Then I am fortunate you were riding this way. You are fortunate the storm did not begin an hour later, when I would have already been indoors." He said it without any apparent awareness that it might have sounded harsh, simply as a statement of fact, and Margaret found herself studying him more closely, trying to understand a man who could speak of her narrow escape from death with all the emotion of a man discussing the weather. The driver was still apologizing, wringing his hands over the state of the horses, and the rider turned to him with brisk, practical questions about the animals, about the road ahead, about whether the carriage itself had taken any damage that would prevent it continuing. He moved among the chaos with the calm of a man accustomed to taking charge of disasters not his own, and Margaret watched him do it with a curious, unsettled feeling she could not quite place. "You have not told me your name," she said, when he returned his attention to her. He hesitated, just slightly, as though the question required more consideration than it should have. "Selworth," he said finally. "This is my land you nearly drowned upon." Margaret felt her cheeks warm despite the cold rain. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in the county knew the name and the stories that traveled alongside it, of a duke who kept to himself, who had turned away half the eligible young women in the district without so much as a second glance, who was said to be cold, distant, unmoved by anything at all. She had not expected to owe her life to him. "Then I am doubly in your debt," she said, "for the rescue, and for trespassing upon your hospitality without an invitation." "The river does not care whose land it runs through," he said. "I would have done the same for anyone." It should have been a reasonable thing to say. Instead it landed strangely, as though he were reminding himself of something rather than informing her, and Margaret found herself wondering what exactly he was reminding himself against. "Nevertheless," she said, "you have my gratitude, your grace. I am Margaret Ashford." He inclined his head, a small, formal gesture, and something in his eyes shifted again, quick and unreadable, before he stepped back toward his own horse. "You should have the wheel examined before you continue," he said. "All business again. I will send a man from the house to see you safely to the next crossing." He did not wait for her thanks. He was mounted again within moments, and then he was gone, back across the field the way he had come, leaving Margaret standing in the rain beside a carriage that had nearly killed her, staring after a man who had saved her life, and spoken of it as though it were nothing at all. The driver climbed back to his seat, still murmuring apologies under his breath, and Margaret allowed herself to be helped into the carriage once more, though her legs did not entirely trust themselves to carry her there unaided. Through the window she watched the figure of the Duke grow smaller across the field, his dark coat blending with the trees until she could no longer be certain she was watching him at all, rather than simply the memory of him. The wheel, when a groom arrived from the house some quarter-hour later to examine it, proved to have taken no real damage, though the man insisted on walking the horses the remaining distance to the next crossing all the same, leading them slowly along a drier path that kept well clear of the river's edge. Margaret sat wrapped in a blanket someone had thoughtfully provided, watching the water recede behind them, and found she could not stop turning the last quarter-hour over in her mind. She had heard of Selworth before, in the careless way one hears of a neighbor one has never met, a name mentioned at her aunt's table alongside remarks about his wealth, his land, his unfortunate reputation for coldness. She had pictured, without quite meaning to, an older man, stern and gray, the sort who collected disapproval the way other men collected snuff boxes. The man who had ridden out of the storm to catch her horses bore no resemblance to that picture at all, and she found herself unsettled by how thoroughly her assumptions had been overturned in the space of a few minutes. It was not merely that he was younger than she had imagined, though he was. It was the strange contradiction of him, the way his voice had been cold even as his actions had been anything but, the way he had spoken of her narrow escape from the river as though reciting the price of grain, and yet had ridden hard enough across broken ground to risk his own neck in stopping her horses. A man did not do that for a stranger unless something beneath the coldness burned rather warmer than he wished anyone to see. She thought of the flicker in his eyes when she had made her small joke about the view from inside the carriage, the almost smile that had come and gone so quickly she could almost convince herself she had imagined it. She thought of the way he had reminded himself, rather than her, that he would have done the same for anyone, as though the words were meant to hold something at a distance. By the time the carriage reached the village and drew up outside her aunt's small cottage, the rain had softened to a fine mist, and Margaret's hands had finally stopped their trembling. Her aunt, informed by the anxious driver of the entire ordeal before Margaret had even crossed the threshold, fussed over her with tea and dry stockings, and a great deal of scandalized commentary on the state of the roads, on the foolishness of traveling in such weather, on the mercy of Providence in sending the Duke of Selworth riding by at precisely the right moment. A cold man, they say, her aunt remarked, settling into her chair with the satisfied air of a woman about to share a piece of gossip she had been saving. Lost his wife some years back, and never been the same since, though I could not tell you the particulars. Keeps to himself out at the hall. Turned away half the mothers in the county who came calling with their daughters in tow. Margaret said nothing to this, only wrapped her hands around her teacup and watched the steam curl upward, though she found she was listening rather more closely than she wished to admit. A man who had lost his wife. A man who kept to himself. It explained something of the coldness, perhaps, though it explained nothing at all of the way he had thrown himself across a flooded field to save a stranger he owed nothing. That night, lying awake in the narrow bed in her aunt's spare room, Margaret found she could not stop hearing the river, though the cottage stood well clear of any water at all. She heard it in the rain still falling softly against the window, in the wind moving through the trees outside, and beneath it all, she heard again the low, steady voice that had calmed a runaway horse in the middle of a storm, and wondered, before sleep finally claimed her, whether she would ever have occasion to hear it again. She did not know, lying there in the dark with her heart finally slowing to something like its ordinary rhythm, that she would think of those gray eyes again long after the storm had passed. She did not know that the river behind her, still churning brown and furious beneath the narrow bridge, would call her back to that exact spot before the year was through. She knew only that her heart, for the first time in longer than she could remember, was not entirely at rest, and that the feeling, strange as it was, did not entirely displease her. The letter sat unopened on the small table by the window for 3 full days before Margaret finally worked up the courage to write one of her own instead. It seemed a poor sort of gratitude to survive a flooded river and a runaway carriage only to send a note of thanks weeks later, and so on the 4th morning she asked her aunt's groom to hitch the small gig and drove herself the 2 miles to Selworth Hall before she could think better of the plan entirely. The house rose out of the mist as she approached it, gray stone against a grayer sky, larger than anything she had ever called home, and somehow colder for its size, as though the building itself had absorbed something of its owner's reputation. She sat in the gig at the base of the drive for a full minute, gathering her nerve, before she finally clicked the reins and continued forward. A footman answered the door with an expression that suggested unexpected callers were not a common occurrence at Selworth Hall, and Margaret found herself explaining, rather more than once, that she had come to thank His Grace personally for an act of rescue some days prior, and that she understood perfectly well he might not be at home to visitors, but that she would be grateful if her card could be delivered regardless. She was left waiting in a hall so large her voice would have echoed had she dared to speak, surrounded by portraits of Selworth ancestors who all seemed to share the same unyielding gray eyes, watching her with silent, painted disapproval. She had nearly decided the whole errand had been a mistake, and was composing in her mind a graceful way to withdraw, when the footman returned and informed her that His Grace would see her in the library. The library, at least, was warmer than the hall, a fire burning low in the grate and shelves rising floor to ceiling with more books than Margaret had ever seen gathered in one place. The Duke stood near the window with his back to the door, and did not turn immediately when she entered, so that she had a moment to study him before he knew he was observed. He looked different out of the rain, though no less guarded. His dark coat was plainer than she had expected for a man of his rank, his hair slightly disordered as though he had run a hand through it more than once that morning, and there was a stillness to the way he stood that suggested a man holding himself carefully in check, the way one holds a door closed against a wind trying to force it open. "Miss Ashford." He turned finally, and his expression, if anything, grew more guarded rather than less. "I did not expect a visit. I could not in good conscience leave without thanking you properly," she said. A note seemed insufficient, given the circumstances. A note would have sufficed. It was not unkind, exactly, but it was not warm either, and Margaret felt the small flare of courage that had carried her this far begin to waver. "Perhaps," she allowed, "but I find I prefer to settle my debts in person, when it is within my power to do so." She lifted her chin slightly, refusing to be dismissed quite so easily, as his tone suggested he wished. "You saved my life, Your Grace. I would be a poor sort of woman if I did not at least look you in the eye while I said as much." Something shifted in his expression. So briefly she nearly missed it. A flicker of surprise quickly smoothed away. He gestured toward a chair near the fire, an invitation rather than a command, and Margaret took it, arranging her skirts with hands that had nearly stopped trembling before this conversation, and had now begun again for entirely different reasons. "You are fortunate the river was not higher," he said, taking the chair opposite, though he sat at its very edge, as though prepared to rise again the moment the conversation grew tiresome to him. Another week of rain, and the bridge would not have held even under ordinary weight. Then I am fortunate twice over, once for the timing of the storm and once for the timing of your ride. She watched him carefully as she spoke, trying to read past the flat composure of his face to whatever lay beneath it. May I ask what brought you out in such weather? It seems an unlikely hour for riding. A pause, longer than the question warranted. I ride that road most days, he said finally, regardless of weather. There was something in the way he said it, some weight beneath the simple words, that made Margaret suspect there was more to the answer than he intended to give her. But she did not press. She had learned enough, in her years as a vicar's daughter accustomed to sitting with the grieving and the troubled, to recognize when a door had been opened only a crack and no further invitation would be extended to push it wider. Then the county owes that habit a debt as great as my own, she said instead, and was rewarded with another of those flickering almost smiles, gone as quickly as it appeared. They spoke a while longer, of nothing of particular consequence, the weather, the state of the roads, the small business of the county that filled the silences between people who did not yet know each other well enough for anything deeper. And yet Margaret found, as the conversation continued, that the Duke's coldness was not quite what she had been led to expect. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his observations carried a dry, precise wit that caught her off guard more than once, drawing surprised laughter from her that seemed to surprise him equally. It was the arrival of his aunt, a formidable woman named Lady Prescott who kept house at Selworth Hall and clearly ruled its corridors with an iron will beneath a soft voice, that finally broke the conversation's spell. She swept into the library with the air of a woman accustomed to commanding any room she entered, took one look at Margaret, and declared that no proper visitor should be sent home without refreshment, regardless of what her nephew's notoriously poor manners might suggest was acceptable. The Duke's expression, at this, took on something almost like resignation, and Margaret hid a smile behind her teacup as Lady Prescott settled into the conversation, with the enthusiasm of a woman who had clearly not had a new face to talk to in some time. She asked after Margaret's family, her aunt's health, the particulars of her upbringing as a vicar's daughter, and Margaret answered honestly, aware the entire time of gray eyes watching her from across the room with an attention that had nothing to do with politeness, and everything to do with something else entirely. You must forgive my nephew his manner, Lady Prescott said at one point, with the casual cruelty of a relative who has long since stopped worrying about giving offense. He was not always so grim. There was a time this house heard laughter rather more often than it does now. Aunt. The single word carried a warning Margaret had not yet heard in his voice, low and sharp, and Lady Prescott, to her credit, subsided at once, though not without a look that suggested the subject was far from closed between them. Margaret said nothing, though she filed the exchange away carefully, another piece of a puzzle she had not intended to begin solving, and now found she could not quite set aside. A house that had once heard laughter, a man who rode the same flooded road every day regardless of weather, a grief that Lady Prescott had referenced only obliquely, and the Duke had shut down before it could go any further. Before she could rise to take her leave, Lady Prescott announced, with the tone of a woman who considered the matter already settled, that Margaret simply must see the gardens before departing, as the roses along the south wall were at their finest this time of year, and it would be a crime against good sense to travel 2 miles and miss them entirely. The Duke's expression suggested he had opinions about being volunteered for garden tours without his consent, but he said nothing, and a few minutes later found himself walking beside Margaret along a gravel path, while his aunt trailed a discreet distance behind, ostensibly cutting flowers for the dinner table but watching the pair ahead of her with the sharp attention of a woman thoroughly enjoying herself. The roses were, in fact, remarkable, climbing a low stone wall in shades of deep red and pale cream, and Margaret paused beside them, breathing in the scent, aware of the Duke standing a careful distance away with his hands clasped behind his back, watching her rather than the flowers. Your aunt has good taste, she said, if only to break a silence that had begun to feel weighted with things neither of them seemed willing to say. My late wife planted them, he said, and the words came out flat, almost startled, as though he had not intended to say them at all, and was now uncertain what to do with the fact that he had. Margaret went very still, uncertain whether to acknowledge the confession or let it pass as though unheard. She chose, in the end, to look at him directly rather than away, sensing that he had spent a great many years being handled carefully by people who did not know what else to do with his grief, and that careful handling was perhaps the last thing he wanted from her. They are lovely, she said simply. She must have had a gift for it. He studied her for a long moment, as though testing the words for pity, and finding, to his evident surprise, none. She did, he said finally, among other gifts. He looked away, toward the wall of roses, and something in his profile carried a weight Margaret suspected he rarely allowed anyone to see. It has been 4 years. You need not explain yourself to me, Your Grace. I am not certain I am explaining myself to you, he said, with the ghost of that dry humor she had glimpsed earlier. I believe I may simply be thinking aloud and you happen to be standing nearby. Margaret smiled at that, unable to help herself, and after a moment, to her genuine surprise, he returned it, briefly, before the guarded composure settled back over his features like a curtain drawn closed. They walked on a little further in a silence that felt, this time, considerably less weighted than before, past a small stone fountain gone quiet with disuse, and a row of old oaks whose branches met overhead to form a corridor of dappled light. You ride that road every day, she said eventually, returning to the question he had left unanswered in the library. The one by the river. He did not answer at once, and she thought perhaps she had pushed too far after all, until he spoke, quietly, his eyes fixed on some point ahead of them rather than on her. My wife died on that road, he said, not at the bridge itself, but close enough. A crossing gave way beneath her carriage during a flood, much like the one that nearly claimed yours. He paused. I was not with her. I have ridden that stretch of road nearly every day since, in every weather, though I could not tell you precisely what I believe I am watching for. Margaret felt the full weight of what he had just told her settle over the afternoon like a shadow, and understood, all at once, the particular horror he must have felt riding out into a storm to find another carriage racing toward that same stretch of water. It was not simple chance that had put him on that road in time to save her. It was 4 years of a habit built from grief, from guilt, from some private vigilance he had never expected to matter again. Then I owe my life to a habit born of the worst day of yours, she said quietly. I am sorry for it, and grateful for it, in equal measure, and I am aware those two things sit uneasily together. They do, he agreed. I have not yet found a way to hold them separately myself. He glanced at her then, something unguarded in his expression for just a moment before the wall came back up. You are remarkably direct, Miss Ashford. My father is a vicar, she said. I have spent my life sitting with people in their worst hours. I find that gentleness helps them more than delicacy does, though I am aware the two are often confused for one another. They are not the same thing at all, he said, though I believe you may be the first person to say so to me directly since my wife died. He looked as though the observation surprised him as much as it seemed to please him, in some quiet, complicated way, and Margaret found herself wondering how many years it had been since anyone had spoken to this man without either fear or careful pity coloring every word. They returned to the gig not long after, Lady Prescott arriving a moment behind them with an armful of cut roses, and a look of poorly concealed satisfaction that suggested she had heard rather more of the conversation than either of them had realized, though she said nothing of it beyond pressing a small bundle of the blooms into Margaret's hands for the drive home. You did not need to come today, he said, as he helped her up into the seat, his hand steady beneath her own. The debt, if there was one, was settled the moment your carriage stopped safely. Perhaps, Margaret said, gathering the reins, but I find I am glad I came regardless. She looked down at him, at the guarded face that had softened, however slightly, over the course of an afternoon spent in her company, and felt something warm and unfamiliar settle low in her chest. Good day, Your Grace. Miss Ashford. He inclined his head, and stepped back from the gig, and Margaret drove away down the long drive with the distinct sense that she had not, in fact, settled any debt at all, but had instead begun accruing an entirely new one, of a kind she did not yet have a name for. She thought of him the whole drive home, of the flicker of his rare smile, and the sharpness beneath his silence, and of the strange, aching curiosity Lady Prescott's careless words had planted in her, about a house that had once known laughter, and a man who had somewhere along the way forgotten how to let it in. The pain in Margaret's wrist woke her before dawn, a sharp, insistent throb that had been merely an ache the night before and had somehow, overnight, become something considerably worse. She sat up in the narrow bed at her aunt's cottage and found she could not close her hand around the edge of the blanket without a gasp escaping her, and understood, with some dismay, that whatever she had done to it during the carriage crash had not healed itself with a few days of rest as she had hoped. Her aunt took one look at the swelling by breakfast and declared, in the tone of a woman who would not be argued with, that Margaret required a proper physician rather than the country remedies available in their small village, and that the nearest one worth consulting kept rooms not 2 miles from Selworth Hall. A note was sent within the hour, and by early afternoon, Margaret found herself once again traveling the road toward the Duke's estate, this time with her arm bound in a makeshift sling, and her nerves considerably less steady than the injury alone could account for. The physician, when he finally examined her, pronounced the wrist sprained rather than broken, though badly enough that it would require several days of careful rest, without travel, without strain, without the jostling of a carriage over country roads. Margaret received this news with a sinking feeling that had nothing to do with the injury itself, and everything to do with the fact that her aunt's cottage, small as it was, offered no proper place for such convalescence, crowded as it already was with her aunt's own frailty, and the single spare room Margaret currently occupied. It was Lady Prescott who settled the matter before Margaret had even finished protesting that she could not possibly impose further on the Selworth household. The formidable woman arrived at the physician's rooms herself, summoned by some network of servants' gossip that seemed to reach every corner of the county within hours, and declared, with an authority that brooked no argument from anyone present, that Margaret would recuperate at Selworth Hall, where there were rooms enough for a dozen invalids and staff enough to see her properly cared for, and that any further discussion of the matter was simply a waste of everyone's time. Margaret caught sight of the Duke's face when he was informed of the arrangement that evening, standing in the doorway of the drawing-room where she had been installed with her arm properly set and a cushion arranged behind her at an angle the housekeeper insisted was best for the healing of sprains. He did not look pleased, exactly, but neither did he look as opposed as she had half expected, and when Lady Prescott asked him directly whether he had any objection to a guest remaining under his roof for a week or more, he was quiet long enough that Margaret found herself holding her breath before he answered. "None," he said finally, and something in the single word carried more weight than its brevity should have allowed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Margaret had not anticipated, and found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, enjoying more than she had expected to. Her mornings began with tea brought up by a quiet maid named Charlotte, who fussed over the arrangement of pillows with more enthusiasm than the task strictly required, and clearly relished having a new face in the house to look after. Her afternoons were spent variously in the library, in the small sitting room that caught the best of the afternoon light, or, when her strength allowed, walking slowly through the gardens with Lady Prescott, who proved an endless font of stories about the county, the family, and increasingly, about her nephew. It was the evenings, though, that Margaret found herself anticipating most, when the household settled into quiet, and the Duke, more often than not, joined her in whichever room she had claimed for the day, ostensibly to inquire after her comfort but staying, invariably, rather longer than such an inquiry required. Their conversations ranged further than she had expected from a man of his reputation. He spoke, once he had been drawn out of his initial guardedness, with real intelligence about the management of his estate, about books he had read and disagreed with, about a dry and unexpected sense of humor that emerged more freely each time they spoke, as though it had simply been waiting, unused, for an audience willing to draw it out. Margaret found herself laughing more in that house than she had in months, and found, too, that she was beginning to watch for the particular way his expression eased when something she said caught him off guard, the small crack in his composure that seemed to widen, however slightly, with each passing day. "You are staring, Miss Ashford," he observed one evening, some 4 days into her stay, as she sat with a book open unread in her lap, and her attention fixed instead on the fire, and on him, seated across from it with a glass of wine he had barely touched. "I am thinking," she corrected, which occasionally requires staring at something, and the fire seemed the least objectionable choice. "And what conclusion has your thinking reached?" She considered lying, offering some polite deflection about the weather or the state of her wrist, but something about the quiet of the evening, and the particular openness in his face just then, made her choose honesty instead. "I am thinking that the county has you entirely wrong," she said. "They call you cold, Your Grace, and distant, and I confess I believed it myself before I had cause to know otherwise. But I do not think you are cold at all. I think you have simply stopped expecting anyone to stay long enough to discover as much." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Margaret began to fear she had overstepped, said too much, presumed too far into territory that was not hers to enter. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it, stripped of its usual guarded precision. "After Eleanor died," he said, and it was the first time Margaret had heard his wife's name spoken aloud in that house. "People were kind to me for a time. Kindness, I discovered, has a season, like everything else. It lasted perhaps a year, and then the invitations began to arrive again, the mothers with their daughters, the calculations behind every smile directed my way. I found it easier, after a while, to simply stop expecting warmth to mean anything, because so often it did not. "And now?" Margaret asked, before she could stop herself. He looked at her then, directly, in a way that made her acutely aware of her own pulse. "Now I find myself considerably less certain of my own conclusions than I was a fortnight ago," he said, "which I confess is not an entirely comfortable position for a man who has spent 4 years cultivating certainty as a form of protection." Margaret did not know how to answer that, and so she said nothing at all, only held his gaze across the firelit room until Lady Prescott's return, some minutes later, broke the moment with cheerful, oblivious chatter about the state of the roses and whether the frost might come early this year. But the moment did not entirely dissolve, not for Margaret, who lay awake that night turning his words over in her mind, and not, she suspected, for the Duke either, whose behavior over the following days took on a quality she could only describe as deliberate, though deliberate toward what end she did not yet dare to name even to herself. He began seeking her out in the mornings as well as the evenings, finding excuses to walk with her when her wrist had healed enough to allow slow turns about the garden, bringing her books he thought she might enjoy and staying to discuss them rather than simply delivering them and departing. Lady Prescott watched all of this with an expression of such transparent delight that Margaret began to suspect the older woman was quietly orchestrating opportunities for the two of them to be thrown together, discovering sudden urgent business elsewhere the moment she judged a conversation to be reaching some interesting point. A letter arrived for the Duke on the 6th day of Margaret's stay, delivered at breakfast by a footman who set it beside his plate with the particular care of a servant, who recognized handwriting likely to sour his master's morning. Margaret watched him read it, watched the brief tightening of his jaw before he folded it away without comment, and might have thought nothing further of it had Lady Prescott not sighed rather loudly over her tea the moment he left the room to attend to some estate matter. "That will be from Lady Vane again," the older woman said, with the air of someone who had been waiting for permission to complain. "She has been circling my nephew since before poor Eleanor was 2 years in the ground, and I confess I have never met a woman more determined to mistake persistence for affection." "Lady Vane?" Margaret asked, and was surprised by the small, unpleasant twist of feeling the name produced in her chest, something she did not have leisure to examine too closely with Lady Prescott, watching her with undisguised interest. "A widow herself, and handsome enough, and possessed of exactly the sort of connections that would suit a duke very well on paper," Lady Prescott said. "She has been angling for an invitation to Selworth for a house party these past 2 years, and Julian has been declining her with admirable consistency, though I sometimes wonder if he does it from genuine disinterest, or simple stubbornness. The two are not always easy to tell apart in that family." She patted Margaret's hand with sudden gentleness. "Do not trouble yourself over her, my dear. She has never once managed to hold his attention for longer than a single dance, and I have watched her try rather harder than that." Margaret said nothing, though the conversation lingered with her through the rest of the morning, a small, unwelcome shadow at the edge of what had otherwise been the happiest week she could remember in a very long time. She told herself it was nothing to her, that the Duke's correspondence and his choice of company were entirely his own affair, and found, despite her best efforts, that she could not quite convince herself of her own indifference. It was later that same afternoon, while walking the garden path with her wrist finally strong enough to forego its sling, that she nearly lost her footing entirely on a loose flagstone hidden beneath a scatter of fallen leaves. She caught herself against the low wall before she fell, but not before a sharp gasp escaped her, and the Duke, walking a pace behind her, was at her side in an instant, one hand steadying her elbow with a speed that suggested some part of him was always braced for disaster, always watching for the moment the ground might give way beneath someone he cared for. "I am quite well," she said, laughing a little unsteadily at his evident alarm. "A loose stone, nothing more." He did not release her arm immediately, and when she looked up at him, the careful composure she had grown accustomed to was, for a moment, entirely absent, replaced by something rawer, something that looked, unmistakably, like fear only just beginning to recede. "Forgive me," he said, releasing her at last, though his voice remained unsteady. "I do not manage these moments with much grace." "You manage them rather better than you believe you do," Margaret said gently. "You simply feel them more than most people would credit, given your reputation for coldness." "My reputation," he said, with a short, humorless laugh, "has become something of a stranger to me these past days." He glanced toward the house, toward the window of the room where, she suspected, his unanswered letter still sat wherever he had left it. "I had a visitor request some weeks ago that I have been putting off answering, a house party of sorts, that certain parties in the county have been rather insistent I host, or at minimum attend elsewhere." Lady Prescott mentioned as much, Margaret admitted, before she could decide whether honesty was wise. Something flickered across his face, not quite surprise, more a kind of resigned acknowledgement that his aunt's discretion had never been especially reliable. Then you will understand why I have found myself considerably less inclined toward the invitation than I might once have been, he said. And though he did not elaborate further, the meaning in his gaze, steady and direct, required no further words at all. Margaret felt her cheeks warm and looked away first, toward the roses that had begun to fade now that the season was turning, unable to hold his attention a moment longer without giving away considerably more of her own feelings than she was yet prepared to admit even to herself. They walked on in a silence that felt, this time, comfortable rather than fraught, the earlier shadow of Lady Vane's letter receding somewhat, though not entirely, at the edge of Margaret's thoughts. It was 2 days later, with her wrist declared fully healed and her aunt sending word that she was expected home before the week was out, that Margaret found herself standing once more in the stable doorway, watching the Duke with Eleanor's old mare, and understanding, with a mixture of joy and dread she could not quite separate from each other, that whatever had begun to grow between them in this house would not survive being left unspoken very much longer. Running a hand along the neck of a tall bay mare, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the guarded man she had first met in the storm. He did not hear her approach at first, and she paused in the doorway, watching him speak low, soothing words to the animal, the same steady cadence she remembered from the moment he had calmed her own runaway horses. She was Eleanor's, he said, without turning, aware of her presence after all. I could not bring myself to sell her, though I rarely ride her myself. It seemed a small enough thing to keep. She is beautiful, Margaret said, stepping closer, and the mare turned large, dark eyes toward her with the same calm curiosity her owner seemed to have inherited, or perhaps taught her. Would you like to meet her properly? He extended his hand, and Margaret crossed the remaining distance to stand beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the cool air of the stable, close enough that when he guided her hand gently toward the mare's neck, his fingers resting briefly over her own, she felt something settle into place inside her chest that she did not yet have words for. She likes you, he said, and there was something in his voice, low and almost wondering, that suggested he was not entirely speaking of the horse. Margaret looked up at him, and found him already watching her, the careful distance he usually maintained nowhere in evidence, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, the only sound the soft shuffle of the mare's hooves against straw, and the quiet rhythm of two people who had each, without quite meaning to, begun to matter a great deal to the other. Julian, she said softly, using his given name for the first time, testing the shape of it, and watched something in his expression shift entirely, some final piece of armor falling away. Margaret. He said her name in return, and the single word carried more warmth than she had heard from him in all their previous conversations combined. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them, though both, she suspected, were aware of exactly how little distance remained. It was Lady Prescott's voice, calling from the house with news that tea had been laid, that finally broke the spell, and Margaret stepped back with a laugh that came out rather more breathless than she intended, aware that whatever had nearly happened in that quiet stable would not remain unspoken between them for very much longer. That night, lying in the fine guest room at Selworth Hall with her wrist finally healed enough that she would be able to return to her aunt's cottage within days, Margaret found herself dreading the departure more than she had dreaded almost anything in recent memory, and understood, with a clarity that both frightened and steadied her, that somewhere in the space of a single week, this cold house and its guarded, grieving Duke had become considerably more than a temporary refuge for a healing wrist. They had become something she was no longer certain she wished to leave behind at all. Margaret returned to her aunt's cottage on a bright, cold morning that felt entirely at odds with the heaviness she carried in her chest, and spent the first days back trying, without much success, to convince herself that the ordinary rhythm of her old life had not become strangely thin and colorless in comparison to the week she had just left behind. Her aunt noticed her distraction almost immediately, and said nothing beyond a knowing look over the breakfast table, which Margaret found nearly as unsettling as an outright question would have been. It was Lady Prescott, arriving unannounced at the cottage door 4 days after Margaret's return, who finally forced the matter into the open. She swept in with a basket of hothouse fruit as an excuse for the visit, and settled herself into the small parlor with the unmistakable air of a woman who had come with a purpose considerably larger than delivering peaches. "He has not been himself," she said, without much preamble, once Margaret's aunt had been persuaded to leave them alone under the pretext of fetching more tea. "Worse than before, if you can credit it. I have known that boy since he was in short trousers, and I have never seen him quite so unsettled as he has been this past week." "I am sorry to hear it," Margaret said carefully, though her heart had begun beating rather faster than the polite conversation warranted. "Are you?" Lady Prescott said, not quite a question, her sharp eyes fixed on Margaret's face with an assessment that felt uncomfortably thorough. "My dear girl, I have watched my nephew mourn for 4 years, and I confess I had begun to fear he intended to make a permanent occupation of it. And then you arrive, quite literally out of a storm, and within a fortnight, I see more of the man he used to be than I have seen since Eleanor died. I do not think that is coincidence, and I do not think you believe it is either." Margaret set down her teacup, uncertain how to answer honestly without saying more than she had any right to say about a man's private feelings, even to his own aunt. "I care for him," she admitted finally, the words feeling both enormous and entirely inadequate at once. "More than I believe is wise, given how little claim I have to his attention." "Claim," Lady Prescott repeated, with something between exasperation and fondness. "You saved him as much as he saved you, though I doubt either of you has said as much aloud. He has spent 4 years riding that wretched road, as though doing penance for a crime he did not commit, and you are the first thing in all that time to give him a reason to look forward rather than only backward." She reached across and pressed Margaret's hand between both of her own. "Go to him. Whatever pride or propriety is keeping you here, set it aside. I have buried enough of my own hesitations to know they rarely serve anyone well in the end." Margaret did not go that day, though the advice lodged itself somewhere deep and would not be dislodged. It was 2 days later, walking alone along the very stretch of road where her carriage had nearly gone into the river, that she found the answer to a question she had not fully allowed herself to ask, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly why the Duke of Selworth rode that road every day regardless of weather. She had gone there almost without deciding to, drawn by some restless need to see the place again now that the danger of it had passed, and found the water considerably calmer than it had been that stormy afternoon, the bridge standing solid and unremarkable in ordinary daylight. She was standing near the rail, looking down at the current, when an elderly man tending a small cottage nearby called out a greeting and, in the easy way of country folk with time and little else to occupy an afternoon, fell into conversation with her about the river, about the bridge's history, and, eventually, about the accident that had claimed the life of the young Duchess 4 years before. "Terrible thing," the old man said, shaking his head. "Storm came up sudden, much like the one you were caught in yourself, if the talk in the village is to be believed. Her Grace was crossing alone, coming back from visiting her sister some miles off, against her husband's wishes, if the gossip is true. He'd asked her to wait out the weather, they say, and she would not, being a spirited sort of woman who did not care much for being told what she could and could not do. He gestured toward the bank a little downstream from the bridge itself. Crossing gave way just there. Duke wasn't with her. Some say he blames himself something fierce for letting her go at all, though I never could see how a man's meant to stop his own wife from doing as she pleases." Margaret stood very still, the pieces of a story the Duke himself had never fully told her finally settling into a shape she could understand. He had not simply lost his wife to misfortune. He had asked her to stay, and she had gone anyway, and he had spent 4 years riding that same road as though some part of him still expected to find her there, still hoped, against all reason, that this time he might arrive in time to change what had already happened long before Margaret's own carriage ever raced toward that water. She understood, too, with a sharpness that nearly took her breath away, exactly what it must have cost him to ride out after her own runaway carriage on that stormy afternoon, to relive, in the space of a few desperate minutes, the very disaster he had spent 4 years failing to outrun. She did not go to Selworth Hall that day, needing time to sit with the weight of what she had learned, but she wrote to him that evening, a short note asking only whether he might call on her the following afternoon, and received, by return messenger before she had even finished her breakfast the next morning, a reply so prompt it could only have been written the moment her own letter arrived. He came at 2 o'clock precisely, and Margaret, watching him dismount from the window of her aunt's small parlor, saw immediately that Lady Prescott had not exaggerated the toll of the past week. He looked tired in a way she had not seen even in the immediate aftermath of the storm, some careful composure worn thin at the edges, and when he was shown into the room, he stood rather than sat, as though uncertain of his welcome despite having been the one to answer her summons so quickly. "I learned something of your wife's accident," Margaret said, seeing no purpose in delaying what she had come to say, "from a man near the bridge. I hope you will forgive me for asking questions that were not mine to ask, but I think, Your Grace, that I understand now why you were riding that road the day you found me." Something crossed his face, quick and unguarded, grief and something rawer beneath it. I asked her to wait, he said, the words coming slowly, as though each one had to be pried loose from somewhere deep and long sealed. The storm was building. I told her the crossing would not be safe, and she laughed, and told me I worried too much, and went anyway, because that was who she was, and I loved her for exactly that stubbornness, even as it frightened me half to death on ordinary days. He stopped, his jaw tight, and Margaret waited, saying nothing, letting the silence hold whatever space he needed it to hold. I was not there. I have told myself for 4 years that being there would have changed nothing, that the water would have taken the carriage, regardless of whether I stood on that bank shouting for her to turn back. I have never entirely believed my own reassurance. And then my carriage went toward that same water, Margaret said quietly, and you had a second chance to arrive in time. Yes? The single word carried the weight of 4 years within it. I have never told anyone that, quite so plainly. Not even my aunt, though I suspect she has guessed at it regardless. You did arrive in time, Margaret said, moving closer, close enough now that she could see the exact shade of gray in his eyes, storm-colored, steady even now. You saved me, Julian, and I think some part of you has spent this past fortnight believing that fact ought to have mended something inside you that has not, in truth, mended at all. He looked at her, something breaking open in his expression that she had never seen there before. Not guardedness, not grief alone, but something rawer and more hopeful threaded through both. You saved something in me as well, he said. I did not expect that. I confess I had stopped expecting anything at all. Then perhaps, Margaret said, her voice unsteady now with an honesty she could no longer temper, we might stop expecting so little, both of us, and see what remains possible instead. He crossed the remaining distance between them then, and took her hand in both of his own, the same steady grip that had once helped her down from a wrecked carriage now offering something considerably more than simple rescue. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the weight of everything finally said between them settling into something that felt, for the first time in 4 years for one of them, and considerably longer than that for the other, remarkably close to peace. There is something I would like to show you, he said finally, releasing her hand only to offer his arm instead, if you are willing, and if your aunt can spare you a little longer this afternoon. Margaret agreed, curious despite the tenderness still settling over the room, and within the half hour found herself once more in the carriage bound for Selworth Hall, though this time the journey felt entirely unlike the one that had first brought her there in terror. He led her not to the library or the gardens this time, but up a narrow staircase to a portrait gallery she had not yet seen, where a painting of a laughing young woman with dark hair and bright, mischievous eyes hung in a place of quiet prominence among the more formal ancestral portraits surrounding it. Eleanor, he said simply, standing before the painting with an expression Margaret had not seen on him before, grief still present but no longer sharp-edged, softened instead into something closer to fond remembrance. I had this moved up here some months ago. It used to hang in the main hall, where I passed it a dozen times a day and could not look at it without feeling as though the house itself had turned to accuse me of something. I could not bring myself to remove it entirely, but I found I needed it somewhere I chose to visit rather than somewhere I could not avoid. Margaret studied the painting, and found in it a warmth that matched everything Lady Prescott had hinted at over the past fortnight. A woman who had clearly filled this house with exactly the laughter its current stillness so sorely lacked. She was beautiful, Margaret said honestly, and I think, from everything I have heard of her, considerably braver than most. Braver than was always wise, he said, though the words carried no bitterness now, only a kind of weary affection. I loved her for it regardless. I do not think loving you diminishes that, though I confess I spent the better part of this past week fearing it might, as though grief and this new feeling could not possibly occupy the same heart without one destroying the other. And now? Margaret asked softly. Now I think perhaps grief simply makes room, given enough time and the right sort of patience, he said, turning from the portrait to look at her instead. I did not expect to find that patience in a woman who arrived at my door soaked through and terrified, insisting on thanking me for doing nothing more than what any decent man would have done. But I find I am glad, more than I have words to properly express, that you did. Margaret reached for his hand again, and this time he did not simply hold it but drew her closer, until the portrait of the woman who had once filled this house with laughter watched over the two of them standing quietly together beneath her painted gaze, a grief honored rather than escaped, and a new warmth allowed, at last, to take root alongside it. But even as Margaret allowed herself to feel the full warmth of that moment, she could not entirely shake the memory of Lady Vane's letter, still unanswered as far as she knew. and the quiet certainty that whatever had grown between herself and the Duke of Selworth would not go unnoticed or unchallenged by a county that had its own ideas about who deserved to stand beside him. The whispers reached Margaret's aunt's cottage before Margaret herself fully understood what had begun to circulate through the county, arriving first as a strange coolness in the greetings of women who had previously been perfectly cordial at church, then as a pointed silence when she entered the village shop, and finally, unmistakably, in the form of a note left anonymously at the cottage door, its handwriting disguised but its cruelty entirely plain. She read it standing in the front hall, her aunt hovering anxiously behind her, and felt the words settle into her stomach like stones. It suggested, in language dressed up with just enough delicacy to avoid outright vulgarity, that a vicar's daughter of no particular fortune had contrived rather conveniently to nearly drown herself on a duke's land, had then extended a simple visit of thanks into a week-long stay under his roof, and had, by design rather than accident, positioned herself to catch a lonely, grieving man at his most vulnerable. It was signed only with the initial V. Lady Vane, her aunt said grimly, reading over Margaret's shoulder, or someone acting on her behalf. I have heard she has grown considerably less patient since word of your visits to Selworth Hall began to travel. Margaret folded the note carefully, her hands steadier than she felt, and said nothing for a long moment. She had known, in some quiet corner of her mind, that whatever had grown between herself and the Duke would eventually draw attention, but she had not fully prepared herself for the particular ugliness of being cast, in the county's imagination, as a scheming opportunist, rather than simply a woman who had fallen, entirely against her own expectations, into genuine feeling. The rumor, once loosed, proved considerably harder to contain than she had hoped. Within days it had traveled well beyond the immediate circle of gossips who had originated it, taking on new and uglier details with each retelling, until Margaret found herself the subject of speculation in households she had never even visited, cast as a fortune-hunting schemer who had engineered a carriage accident for the express purpose of trapping a title. Margaret had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Sunday service might offer some small respite from the whispers, a place where common decency might hold sway over idle gossip for at least the space of an hour. She was disabused of this hope the moment she and her aunt took their usual pew, and felt, rather than saw, the ripple of attention that moved through the congregation behind them, heads turning, voices dropping to the particular hushed register reserved for the most delicious sort of scandal. She kept her eyes forward through the entire service, her spine straight, her expression carefully composed, though she could feel the weight of a dozen curious stares pressing against her from every direction. It was only afterward, in the churchyard, that the cruelty found its voice directly, when a cluster of women she had known casually for years drew back from her approach with theatrical care, as though her very proximity might prove contagious, and one, a Mrs. Fairweather whose husband held the largest farm in the parish, remarked to her companions in a voice pitched deliberately to carry, that she had always thought a vicar's daughter ought to know better than to angle so shamelessly above her station. Margaret's face burned, though she forced herself to walk past them with her chin level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a visible reaction. It was her aunt, normally the gentlest of women, who turned back sharply enough to startle the entire group into silence, informing them in no uncertain terms that she had known every one of them since they were children in short frocks, and had never once heard such ungenerous talk pass for Christian charity, in all her years attending that church. The walk home was quiet, Margaret's composure cracking only once they were well clear of the churchyard, when she finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall, angry as much as hurt, furious at the unfairness of being condemned for a kindness that had grown, entirely without scheming on her part, into something she had never dared to plan for or expect. It was Lady Prescott, arriving at the cottage with a face like thunder, who confirmed the full scope of the damage. Lady Vane has been busy, she said, settling into the parlor chair with none of her usual warmth, replaced instead by a controlled fury that Margaret found almost more unsettling than the rumors themselves. She called on 3 separate households this week alone, each visit somehow producing a fresh detail about your supposed scheming, each detail more absurd than the last. I have heard, if you can credit it, that you are now rumored to have loosened the carriage wheel yourself before ever setting out that day. That is absurd, Margaret said, though the absurdity did little to lessen the sting of it. Of course it is, Lady Prescott said, but absurdity has rarely stopped gossip from spreading, my dear, and I fear it will not stop now. She reached for Margaret's hand, her expression softening. Julian does not yet know the full extent of it. I have not had the heart to tell him, and I suspect the servants have been similarly reluctant, knowing his temper where you are concerned." Margaret felt a fresh wave of dread at this. "He must not hear it from someone else," she said. "If this reaches him without warning, I fear what it might do, both to his standing and to whatever trust has grown between us." But the warning came too late. The Duke arrived at the cottage himself the following afternoon, his face set in an expression of controlled fury that Margaret had not seen from him before, not even in the immediate aftermath of the storm that had first brought them together. He had heard, it transpired, not from careful family diplomacy but from Lady Vane herself, who had called upon him directly under the transparent pretext of expressing sympathy for the difficulties his association with Margaret had apparently caused him, and had taken evident pleasure in reciting, in detail, every ugly rumor now circulating through the county. "I told her precisely what I thought of her sympathy," he said, pacing the small parlor with barely contained anger, "and I do not believe she will trouble me with another such visit soon. But the damage she intended is already done, Margaret, and I am furious that it has fallen on you, rather than on the woman who set it in motion." "It is not your fault," Margaret said, though she could see plainly that he did not believe this, could see the guilt already gathering behind his anger, the familiar shadow of a man accustomed to holding himself responsible for harm that came to those he cared for. "I brought you into my house," he said. "I encouraged your visits, invited you into rooms and conversations that gave exactly the sort of woman as Lady Vane every opportunity to twist an act of simple gratitude into something ugly. If I had been more careful, more mindful of how such things appear to a county with nothing better to occupy its attention, then we would never have had those weeks at all," Margaret said firmly, cutting through his spiraling guilt with a directness she had learned, over their weeks of acquaintance, was often the only thing capable of reaching him. "I do not regret them, Julian. Whatever the gossips choose to say about my reasons for accepting your hospitality, I will not pretend otherwise simply because it would be more convenient for the county's comfort." He stopped his pacing and looked at her, something in his expression torn between admiration and continued distress. "The rumors will not simply fade," he said. "I have some experience of how these things travel. Even should Lady Vane cease her efforts entirely, the story has already taken on a life of its own, and I fear it will follow you regardless of what either of us says or does now." Margaret felt the truth of this settle over her with a weight she had been trying, until that moment, to hold at a careful distance. She thought of her father, still living, still serving his parish with the quiet dignity that had shaped her own upbringing, and of how such a scandal, however unjust, might reflect upon him, upon the family name that was, in the end, all she truly had of her own to protect. "Perhaps," she said slowly, the words costing her more than she had expected, "it would be better if I returned to my father's house for a time. Let the rumors exhaust themselves without fresh fuel to sustain them. Whatever grows between us, Julian, cannot be built on a foundation the entire county believes to be built on scheming and deceit." "No." The word came sharp and immediate, and he crossed the room to stand before her, taking both her hands in his own, with an urgency that startled her. "I will not have you retreat, because a jealous woman chose cruelty over honesty. I have spent 4 years allowing other people's expectations to dictate the shape of my life, Margaret, and I have no intention of allowing it to happen again now. Not when what stands to be lost matters more to me than anything has mattered in longer than I care to admit." "And what would you have me do instead?" Margaret asked, her voice unsteady, torn between the fierce hope his words kindled and the practical fear that hope alone could not undo the damage already spreading through the county's drawing rooms. He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face, as though the answer he sought might be found there, rather than in his own uncertain heart. "I would have you trust that I do not intend to let you go quietly," he said finally, "though I confess I have not yet decided the precise shape that intention ought to take. Give me a little time, Margaret. Do not retreat to your father's house believing this is the end of anything. I promise you it is not." Margaret searched his face and found, beneath the anger and the guilt still visible there, a determination that steadied her more than any simple reassurance could have. She did not fully believe, standing in that small parlor with the ugly weight of gossip pressing down around them both, that the difficulty could be so easily resolved. But she believed, entirely, that he meant every word of his promise, and found that belief, for the moment, enough to hold against the fear that everything they had built together might yet be undone by a county more interested in scandal than in truth. Lady Vane herself called at the cottage the following morning, an act of boldness that startled Margaret nearly as much as the visit's evident purpose. She was shown into the small parlor with the same careful reluctance Margaret's aunt might have shown a wasp that had wandered in through an open window, and settled herself into a chair with the composed, glittering smile of a woman entirely confident of her own superiority. "I thought it only kind to call," Lady Vane said, "given how difficult these past days must have been for you, Miss Ashford. Gossip is such an unfortunate thing, is it not? However little truth it may contain." "How generous of you to concern yourself," Margaret said, matching the woman's poisonous sweetness with a composure she did not entirely feel. "Though I confess I am surprised to find the source of so much of that gossip expressing such tender concern for its victim." Something flickered across Lady Vane's face, quickly smoothed away. "I cannot imagine what you mean to suggest," she said. "I have simply heard the talk, as everyone has, and thought it my Christian duty to offer what comfort I could. A man of the Duke's position cannot be expected to attach himself permanently to a woman of your circumstances, whatever passing fancy the events of a storm may have produced. It would be kinder, I think, for you to understand that now, before your hopes are allowed to grow beyond what is reasonable. I have never asked you, or anyone else, to manage my hopes on my behalf," Margaret said, rising from her seat, her voice steady despite the anger building beneath her calm exterior. "And I think, Lady Vane, that you have called this morning not from kindness but from disappointment, and I would ask you to take your comfort elsewhere, as I have no need of it." Lady Vane's composure cracked at last, something sharp and unpleasant showing through the careful smile. "You will not hold him," she said, rising as well, her voice losing its silken pretense entirely. "A man like the Duke of Selworth does not marry beneath himself for a fortnight's infatuation. You will see, Miss Ashford, soon enough, and I confess I shall take no small satisfaction in it." She swept from the room without waiting for a response, and Margaret stood alone in the parlor for a long moment afterward, her hands trembling with an anger she had not fully allowed herself to feel until the woman was gone. She wanted, fiercely, to believe Lady Vane's words carried no truth at all, and yet some small, frightened part of her could not entirely silence the doubt the visit had been so deliberately designed to plant. A letter arrived from her father 2 days later, forwarded through the same network of parish gossip that had carried the scandal itself well beyond the borders of the county. His words were gentle, as they always were, but Margaret could read the concern beneath them plainly enough, a father's quiet worry that his daughter's reputation, and by extension his own standing within his parish, might suffer lasting harm from an entanglement she had never intended to seek out. He did not ask her to come home. He would never have presumed to command her so directly. But the invitation was there, folded carefully into every gentle sentence, and Margaret understood that a quieter, more dutiful daughter might have accepted it without a second thought. She sat with the letter for a long while, turning it over in her hands, weighing the plain wisdom of retreat against the fierce, unfamiliar hope that had taken root in her chest over these past weeks. She thought of the Duke's promise, given with such evident sincerity in her aunt's small parlor, and wondered whether hope alone was reason enough to remain in a county that had shown her, in the space of a single week, precisely how quickly kindness could curdle into cruelty when convenient. It was her aunt, of all people, who finally tipped the balance, sitting beside her with a cup of tea neither of them had any real interest in drinking. "I have watched you these past weeks, Margaret," she said, "and I have not seen you happier in all the years you have visited me. Gossip or no gossip. Your father loves you and would welcome you home in an instant, but I do not think he would wish you to run from something true simply because small-minded people have chosen to be cruel about it. That has never been the kind of daughter he raised, nor the kind of woman I have watched you become." Margaret wrote back to her father that evening, a careful, loving letter that neither dismissed his concerns nor promised the retreat he had so gently offered, and found, once it was sealed and sent, that some of the weight pressing on her chest had eased, replaced by a steadier resolve to see this through, whatever shape it finally took. She did not return to her father's house that week, though she withdrew from public view as much as her aunt's small household allowed, waiting, with a patience that grew harder to sustain with each passing day, to discover what shape the Duke's promised intention might finally take, and whether it would prove strong enough to outlast a scandal that showed no immediate signs of losing its appetite. The carriage was already loaded and waiting in the lane when Margaret finally made her decision, her trunk strapped to the back, her aunt standing in the doorway with an expression torn between sympathy and quiet disapproval at what she clearly considered a hasty retreat. 2 weeks had passed since Lady Vane's visit, 2 weeks in which the gossip had shown no sign of exhausting itself, and the Duke, though he had called twice more and written nearly every day, had offered no clearer shape to his promised intention than the vague, urgent reassurance that he needed only a little more time. Margaret had believed him, had wanted to believe him, but 2 weeks of watching her aunt's neighbors cross the street rather than exchange greetings, of receiving fewer and fewer invitations to the small gatherings that had once filled her quiet country life, had finally worn through even her considerable patience. Her father's letters had grown gentler and more insistent in equal measure, And that morning, waking to another cold, gray dawn with no fresh word from Selworth Hall, Margaret had made up her mind that she would not wait to become the permanent subject of a scandal that showed every sign of outlasting whatever affection had once seemed strong enough to withstand it. "You are certain of this," her aunt said, not quite a question, as Margaret climbed into the carriage. "I am certain of very little just now," Margaret admitted, "except that I cannot continue as I have been, waiting for a promise that grows vaguer every time it is repeated. My father's house will at least offer some quiet and some distance from all of this." The carriage set off down the familiar lane, and Margaret settled back against the seat with a heaviness in her chest that she suspected would not lift for a very long time. She did not weep, though she felt the pressure of tears held carefully in check, some stubborn pride refusing to allow them free rein until she was entirely alone. She watched the countryside pass, fields and hedgerows she had come to know intimately over these past months, and tried not to think of gray eyes, or the particular warmth of a rare smile, or a portrait gallery where a laughing woman watched over the quiet, hopeful beginning of something Margaret had allowed herself to believe might last. She was perhaps 3 miles along the road, the familiar shape of the river crossing coming into view ahead, when she heard hoofbeats behind the carriage, fast and urgent, closing the distance with a speed that sent an unwelcome jolt of memory through her, back to a stormy afternoon months before when a similar sound had heralded rescue rather than disaster. She turned in her seat, heart already racing before she had fully registered what she was seeing, and found, through the carriage window, the unmistakable figure of the Duke of Selworth riding hard along the road behind her, his coat streaming, his face set with an urgency she had never seen from him even in their first desperate meeting. "Stop the carriage," she called to the driver, scarcely recognizing her own voice, and the vehicle drew to a halt just short of the bridge, in almost exactly the spot where a runaway team of horses had once nearly carried her to disaster. She was down from the carriage before the wheels had fully stopped turning, and the Duke reined in his horse a few paces away, swinging down with the same controlled economy of movement she remembered from that first meeting, though nothing about his expression now carried the cold composure he had worn then. He crossed the distance between them at a near run, and stopped only when he stood directly before her, breathing hard, his eyes searching her face, as though he feared he had already arrived too late. "You were leaving," he said, without a word. "I wrote to you," Margaret said, though the protest sounded thin even to her own ears. "I told you I intended to return to my father's house, if matters did not improve." "You told me you might," he said. "I did not understand until this morning, when Charlotte came to inform me your aunt's cottage stood empty and your trunk had already gone ahead, that you meant to leave without permitting me the chance to answer properly." He reached for her hands and she allowed him to take them, though her heart was pounding too hard for her to fully trust her own voice just yet. "I have been a fool, Margaret. I told you I needed time, and I meant it honestly, but I understand now that time without explanation must have felt, to you, indistinguishable from indifference, and I am deeply sorry for the pain that misunderstanding must have caused you." "What were you waiting for?" Margaret asked, unable to keep a note of raw hurt from creeping into the question. "For this," he said, and reached into his coat, producing a folded document that he pressed into her hands before she fully understood what he intended. She unfolded it with unsteady fingers, and found herself looking at a formal notice, signed and sealed, publicly announcing his intention to marry, her own name written plainly beside his own, already dispatched, as the accompanying note explained, to every major household in the county, including, with evident deliberate satisfaction, to Lady Vane herself. "I did not want to offer you a private promise easily denied by public gossip," he said, watching her face as she read. "I wanted the county to hear the truth from my own mouth, publicly and unmistakably, before Lady Vane or anyone else could continue twisting the story to their own advantage. It took longer than I intended, arranging the notice properly, ensuring it reached every household that mattered before the ink was even dry, but I did not want to ask for your hand with half measures, Margaret. I wanted it done in a way that left no room for anyone to question the truth of it ever again." Margaret looked up from the document, tears finally overflowing despite her best efforts to hold them back, though these were tears of an entirely different character than the ones she had been suppressing throughout the long, uncertain fortnight behind them. "You might have told me," she said, half laughing through the tears, "rather than allowing me to nearly drive myself into a decline believing you had simply lost interest." "I am learning," he said, with the ghost of that dry humor she had come to love so well, "that grand gestures require rather more patience to arrange properly than I anticipated, and considerably worse timing than I intended, given that I very nearly arrived to find you already gone." His expression sobered, the humor giving way to something raw and entirely sincere. "I could not let you go, Margaret. Not to your father's house, not anywhere. Not without telling you plainly what I have known for weeks now and been too cautious, too afraid of moving too quickly after everything we have both endured, to say aloud until this moment. I love you. I have loved you, I believe, since the very afternoon I pulled your carriage back from this exact water, though it has taken me considerably longer than it should have, to trust that feeling enough to act on it as boldly as it deserved." Margaret felt the last of her doubt dissolve entirely, replaced by a warmth that seemed to spread through her whole chest, driving out weeks of cold uncertainty in a single moment. "I love you as well," she said, "and I think I have known it nearly as long, though I confess I have spent a great many sleepless nights trying to talk myself out of it, given how thoroughly the county seemed determined to punish me for the feeling." "The county," he said, "will simply have to accustom itself to being wrong about a great many things, myself included." He reached up, brushing a tear from her cheek with a gentleness that belied the urgency of his ride, and then, with a sudden, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face into something she suspected very few people in the county had ever been fortunate enough to witness, he asked, "Will you come home with me, Margaret? Not to my aunt's careful chaperonage, and not to another week of convalescence, but properly, permanently, as the woman who will one day be mistress of Selworth Hall, if you will have me." "Yes," Margaret said, without a moment's hesitation, the word carrying all the certainty that had been quietly building in her heart since a storm had first thrown her, quite literally, into this man's path. "Yes, Julian, I will." He kissed her then, there beside the river that had so nearly claimed her life, and had instead, against all reasonable expectation, given her the greatest happiness she had ever known. And Margaret felt the last shadow of the past 2 difficult weeks lift entirely away, replaced by a certainty as steady and unshakable as the man now holding her. Her aunt's carriage driver, watching the entire scene unfold from his seat with poorly concealed delight, cleared his throat rather loudly after a decent interval had passed, prompting a laugh from them both that broke whatever solemnity had briefly held the moment. "I believe," the Duke said, still holding Margaret close, "that your trunk is presently traveling in the wrong direction entirely." "Then I suppose," Margaret said, "we had better turn it around." They rode back to Selworth Hall together that afternoon, Margaret's carriage following behind with her trunk and her still faintly disapproving aunt, who had, by the time they reached the Hall's long drive, been thoroughly won over by the Duke's evident joy, and could not stop remarking on how well the color suited him, this happiness he wore now as plainly as he had once worn his grief. Lady Prescott met them at the door with an expression of such transparent, tearful delight that she could not manage a single coherent sentence of greeting before dissolving into happy tears of her own, embracing Margaret with the fierce affection of a woman who had clearly hoped for exactly this outcome from the very first week of Margaret's stay beneath her roof. That evening, standing once more in the portrait gallery beneath Eleanor's painted, laughing gaze, Margaret felt no shadow in the moment at all, only a quiet gratitude for a grief that had, in its own slow and difficult way, made room enough for a new happiness to grow beside it, rather than in its place. The Duke stood beside her, his hand finding hers in the soft evening light, and together they looked up at the portrait of the woman who had once filled this house with laughter, before he turned to Margaret with the same steady warmth that had first drawn her to him beside a flooded river, and promised, in a voice too quiet for anyone but her to hear, that Selworth Hall would know that laughter again, and would keep it, this time, for good. The weeks between that afternoon at the river and the wedding itself passed more quickly than Margaret would have believed possible, filled with a happiness so complete it seemed almost to make up for the difficulty of everything that had come before. Lady Prescott threw herself into the preparations with an energy that left the entire household faintly breathless, insisting on flowers cut fresh from the very garden where Julian had first confessed the truth of his wife's roses, and Margaret found herself more than once quietly grateful for a woman whose meddling had done so much to bring this happiness about in the first place. Her father arrived a full week before the ceremony, traveling further than he had in years to see his daughter settled, and spent long hours in quiet conversation with Julian in the library, the two men clearly taking each other's measure with the careful thoroughness of a vicar and a duke, each determined to ensure the other truly deserved the person they both loved. Whatever passed between them in those conversations, her father emerged from each one with an expression of deepening approval, and confided to Margaret one evening, with the particular gentleness he reserved for his most important observations, that he had rarely met a man so plainly humbled by his own good fortune, nor so determined to prove himself worthy of it. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, An unremarkable stretch of good weather that Margaret could not help but notice stood in stark contrast to the storm that had first brought her and Julian together, as though the sky itself had decided their story no longer required such dramatic punctuation. She dressed in the small room at her aunt's cottage that had once served as her sick room during that first fortnight of convalescence, her aunt fussing over the arrangement of her hair with hands that trembled slightly from a happiness too large to entirely contain. The church was full nearly to overflowing by the time Margaret arrived. The entire county turned out in force, curiosity, and genuine goodwill mingling in equal measure among the assembled guests. She caught sight of Mrs. Fairweather near the back, dressed in her finest and looking rather more subdued than she had in the churchyard those difficult weeks before, and felt no particular satisfaction in the woman's evident discomfort, only a quiet relief that the ugliness of that season had finally given way to something considerably kinder. Julian stood waiting at the altar as she walked the length of the aisle on her father's arm, and Margaret found she could think of nothing at all in that moment except the steady warmth in his gray eyes, watching her approach with an open, undisguised joy that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the guarded, careful man who had once pulled her carriage back from disaster with barely a flicker of visible feeling. Whatever composure he had spent 4 long years perfecting had been entirely abandoned by the time she reached his side, replaced by an expression so plainly, helplessly happy that Margaret heard more than one soft, delighted laugh ripple through the assembled guests at the sight of it. Her father spoke the words of the ceremony with a voice that grew thick with emotion more than once, and Margaret, listening to vows she had once believed she might never have cause to make, felt the last lingering shadow of the past difficult months lift away entirely, replaced by a certainty as solid and unshakable as the stone walls of the church around them. When Julian finally slid the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady despite the emotion so plainly written across his face. The same steady hands that had once calmed a pair of terrified runaway horses now offering her something considerably more permanent than rescue. The wedding breakfast that followed at Selworth Hall stretched long into the afternoon, laughter and music filling rooms that had stood quiet and shadowed for 4 long years, exactly as Julian had promised beneath Eleanor's portrait that they one day would. Lady Prescott wept happily through nearly the entire celebration, informing anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very first moment Margaret arrived soaked and trembling in the library, that something remarkable had been set into motion that stormy afternoon, though Margaret suspected rather strongly that the older woman's memory of her own immediate certainty had grown considerably more confident with the benefit of hindsight. The rumors, in time, faded exactly as Lady Prescott had once promised they eventually would, overtaken first by the undeniable public fact of the Duke's formal announcement and then, more thoroughly still, by the wedding itself, held at the small parish church where Margaret's own father presided over the ceremony with tears of unguarded joy he made no effort to hide. Lady Vane did not attend, though her absence was noted by precisely no one who mattered, and Mrs. Fairweather, who had once remarked so cruelly in the churchyard, found herself among the very first to offer effusive congratulations once the outcome had become impossible to deny, a hypocrisy Margaret chose to meet with gracious indifference rather than any satisfaction at having been proven right. And every year afterward, on the anniversary of the storm that had first thrown them together, Margaret and Julian rode out to the river crossing together, not in fear this time, nor in grief, but simply to stand beside the water that had so nearly taken everything from them both, and had instead, in its own strange and terrible way, given them everything that mattered most. Snow was falling thick and silent over Selworth land the first winter after the wedding, and Margaret stood at the window of what had once been Eleanor's sitting room and was now unmistakably her own, watching the white drifts gather along the garden wall where roses would bloom again come spring. Behind her, the fire crackled low and warm, and she could hear, distantly, the sound of Julian's voice in the hall below, discussing some matter of estate business with the steward, in a tone that carried none of the guarded coldness she remembered from their first meeting. She had grown accustomed over these past months to the particular rhythm of life at Selworth Hall, to mornings spent walking the grounds with Julian before the household fully woke, to evenings in the library that stretched long into the night with books shared and arguments happily conducted over matters of literature and philosophy that neither of them took entirely seriously. She had grown accustomed, too, to a happiness so steady and complete that she sometimes found herself faintly astonished by it, remembering the terrified young woman who had once been thrown against a carriage door with the river rushing ever closer, and marveling at how completely that single stormy afternoon had reshaped the entire course of her life. It was a letter from Lady Prescott's own correspondence, delivered that same snowy morning, that brought unexpected news into the quiet of the household. The older woman, who had taken up residence in a smaller house on the estate following the wedding, insisting she had no wish to hover over newlyweds however fond she remained of them both, wrote to inform Margaret that Lady Vane had, at last, married a wealthy merchant from the north, a match that society considered rather beneath her former ambitions, and that the news had traveled through the county with no small measure of quiet satisfaction among those who remembered her cruelty toward Margaret the previous year. Margaret read the letter twice, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she felt no particular triumph in the news at all, only a distant, settled peace, the kind that comes from happiness, so complete it no longer requires anyone else's misfortune to feel whole. She set the letter aside and returned to the window, watching the snow continue its slow, silent accumulation across the grounds below. Julian found her there some while later, having concluded his business with the steward, and crossed the room to stand beside her, his arm settling naturally around her waist in the easy, unguarded way that had become so familiar between them these past months. "You look thoughtful," he observed. "Lady Prescott writes that Lady Vane has married," Margaret said. "A merchant, apparently, considerably beneath what she once hoped for." Julian's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, though it carried a similar warmth. "I confess I cannot find it in myself to feel much beyond mild indifference toward the news," he said. "I spent a great deal of energy, once, resenting that woman's persistence, and I find I have no wish to spend any further feeling on her at all, now that I have considerably better things to occupy my attention." He turned Margaret gently to face him, his gray eyes holding a warmth that had become entirely natural to him now, the guarded coldness of their first meeting a distant memory neither of them had cause to revisit. "Speaking of which, I have news of my own, if you are ready to hear it." "You look entirely too pleased with yourself for it to be a state business," Margaret said, studying his expression with growing curiosity. "It is not a state business," he agreed. "I have had a letter from the physician, delivered this morning while you were occupied with your own correspondence. He confirms what your aunt apparently suspected during her visit last week, and what I believe you yourself have suspected for rather longer than you have admitted to me." He watched her face carefully as understanding dawned there, slow and then all at once, and his own composure finally broke entirely into open, unguarded joy. "We are to have a child, Margaret, sometime in the early summer, if the physician's calculations prove accurate." Margaret felt tears rise, unbidden and entirely welcome this time, and reached for both his hands, steadying herself against a happiness so large, it seemed almost too much to hold. "I had wondered," she admitted, laughing through the tears, "though I confess I did not dare hope until it was confirmed beyond any doubt." "A child," Julian said, wonder plain in his voice. "In this house, filling these rooms with exactly the sort of laughter I once believed I had lost the right to ever hear again." He drew her close, resting his forehead against hers, and Margaret felt the full weight of everything they had built together over the past year settle into something even more solid and enduring than she had believed possible on that first terrified afternoon beside the river. The months that followed passed in a haze of quiet preparation, Lady Prescott descending upon the household with an enthusiasm that left the nursery transformed within weeks into a space of soft colors and careful comfort, while Margaret's father wrote letters so frequently filled with joy and anticipation that Margaret began to suspect he had abandoned half his parish duties simply to compose them. Julian, for his part, threw himself into the preparations with a tenderness that surprised even Margaret, who had come to know him well enough over the past year to expect very little that could still catch her by surprise, and yet found herself moved nearly to tears more than once by the quiet, careful way he spoke of the child not yet born, already promising, in low murmured words meant only for her ears, a childhood filled with exactly the warmth and laughter that Selworth Hall had gone so many years without. The child arrived in early summer, as the physician had predicted, a daughter with her father's storm-gray eyes and, from the very first days of her life, an unmistakable stubbornness that Lady Prescott declared, with evident delight, to be inherited directly from her late mother-in-law, whose portrait still hung in the gallery upstairs, watching over the house with the same warm, laughing gaze she always had. They named her Eleanor, a decision Julian made without hesitation, and Margaret embraced without a moment's reservation, understanding, better than anyone else might have, exactly how much healing had been required to arrive at a place where that name could be spoken again, not with grief, but with gratitude. Standing in the nursery some weeks after the birth, watching Julian hold his daughter with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the guarded, distant man the county had once believed him to be, Margaret found herself thinking, not for the first time, of the storm that had first thrown her into his path, of the terrified minutes racing toward a river that had seemed, at the time, certain to claim her life. She thought of how close disaster had come, and how completely that same disaster had instead delivered her into a happiness she had never dared to imagine for herself. A happiness built not on the absence of grief or difficulty, but on the willingness of two wounded people to trust each other enough to heal together rather than alone. Margaret's father came to stay for a full month that autumn, delighting in his granddaughter with an unrestrained joy that softened even further the quiet dignity Margaret had known all her life, and spent long afternoons in the garden with Julian, the two men walking slowly among the roses while the old vicar shared stories of Margaret's own childhood that left Julian laughing more freely than the county would have believed possible of the man they had once called cold and unreachable. Lady Prescott joined them often, insisting she had earned the right to claim at least partial credit for the entire match, a claim neither Margaret nor Julian saw much reason to dispute, given how thoroughly her meddling had smoothed the path between them during those uncertain early weeks. It was during that same visit that a sudden storm rolled in one afternoon, quick and fierce in the way autumn weather so often was, catching the household by surprise as they sat together in the garden. Margaret felt her heart quicken at the first crack of thunder, an old instinctive fear rising before she could entirely master it, memories of a runaway carriage and a flooded road still capable, even now, of tightening something in her chest. Julian noticed immediately, his hand finding hers before the second peal of thunder had fully faded, and led her calmly inside with their daughter gathered safely in her grandfather's arms, no trace of panic in his movements at all, only the steady, practiced calm of a man who had long since made peace with storms, rather than fearing them. They stood together at the window afterward, watching the rain sweep across the grounds in gray curtains, and Margaret found that the old fear, when it came now, no longer arrived alone, but always accompanied by the steadying presence of a man who had once ridden straight into just such a storm to save her, and who would, she knew without any doubt at all, do exactly the same again without a moment's hesitation, storm after storm, for as long as either of them drew breath. "You are not afraid," she observed, watching him study the rain with nothing but calm interest. "I was afraid for 4 years," he said quietly, "of a storm that had already done its worst and could not be undone by any amount of vigilance on my part. This storm," he added, glancing toward her with the warm, unguarded smile that had become so entirely natural to him now, "has nothing left in it to threaten me, so long as I have you and our daughter safely under this roof. I find I have made my peace with thunder, Margaret, in a way I never expected to." Their daughter, entirely unbothered by the weather raging outside, gurgled happily in her grandfather's arms, reaching small fingers toward the window, as though the storm were nothing more than an interesting show arranged entirely for her amusement, and Margaret laughed despite herself, the last of her old fear dissolving into something closer to fond amusement at her daughter's fearless curiosity, so plainly inherited, Lady Prescott insisted later that evening, from both her parents in equal measure. Every year, still, on the anniversary of that first storm, Julian and Margaret rode out together to the river crossing, their daughter eventually old enough to join them, seated proudly before her father on his own horse, listening with wide, fascinated eyes to the story of how her parents had first met, amid thunder and rushing water. And every year, standing beside that same stretch of river that had once nearly taken everything from them both, Margaret felt nothing but gratitude for the storm that had carried her, quite literally, into the life she now called her own, a life filled with exactly the laughter that Selworth Hall had waited 4 long, quiet years to hear again, and would now, she felt certain, never lose.